accent bias, I can study it. I can know everything about it. I can be the biggest advocate in the world. I still have it. We all have it. But the point is, we need to be aware of it and where it's showing up.
You're listening to episode 47 of the Happy Space podcast. Today we're exploring accent bias with linguistic inclusion expert Heather Hansen. Hi, I'm Clare Kumar, your proudly neuroatypical host, exploring the intersection of productivity and inclusivity. I believe that everyone ought to be able to make their richest contribution, but too often people are excluded from spaces, cultures, and experiences. We can do better. I hope that you find inspiration and encouragement in these conversations, for everyone deserves a happy space. Have you ever thought about how someone's accent impacts the way they fit into a place, the way they're accepted, the way they are effective as a communicator, the degree to which they belong? Well, that's the focus of the conversation today. And it's really prevalent here in Canada, where I live. We have seen massive immigration in the last year, and it continues to be very, very strong. And we're seeing more and more cultural mixing. We've always been known for a land of much diversity, and that's only increasing now. And I think we're seeing that in many populations around the world. So the issue of understanding accent bias and how this plays out in the way we communicate and navigate our world is increasingly important. That's why I'm very excited to have Heather Hansen joining today. Heather's an expert in the field. She's already written a book called Unmuted about global communication effectiveness and is a real authority in that space. And she's now exploring in great detail as she studies for a PhD in the topic and is writing another book about accent bias specifically. If you're a native speaker and you won the language lottery, if you will, and you do speak English, she's got strategies to help us understand what to do with this bias and help to create more belonging in the workplace. If you're a non-native speaker, the majority of English speakers, in fact, Heather has simple recommendations to communicate more effectively, some of which she shared in her TEDx talk on bad English. She is, like I said, a PhD candidate and currently writing a book on accent bias. She's also on the Thinkers 50 radar, which is a list of 30 emerging real elite thinkers in the world who they believe has something to offer management thinking for the long term. So it's a next level award, and clearly shines a light on Heather as someone to watch. I'm really thrilled she's joining us today. We explore questions like, can accents make you sound more or less intelligent? Can we get rid of accent bias? And is it okay to laugh? Where, oh, where does humor fit in? So please enjoy meeting Heather Hansen. And if you can take a moment to give us a review for the Happy Space podcast on your platform of choice, I would be most grateful. It's how other people have a better shot at finding the podcast. I love bringing you this content around inclusion and productivity, this intersection of the two, in hopes that we can have a more hospitable world where everyone can make their richest contribution, no matter what your accent. Enjoy. Heather Hansen, welcome to the Happy Space podcast. I'm thrilled you're here today.
I'm so excited. Thanks for having me, Claire.
So I've fallen in love with your work. I watched your TED talk, all about bad English and how prevalent is that. Your book, Unmuted. I want to open this conversation by making an observation on my part, and you can tell me if I'm right or I'm wrong. I sense there's a great deal of empathy in your work to lead you to write a book to help people speak up more effectively in an organization and now work with accent bias. Can you maybe shed a little bit of your connection to empathy, if it's there, and how you came to do this work?
Yes. Oh, that's a great question and phrased in a very nice way. There is an amazing amount of empathy because accent bias in particular is not just something that I research and study and work with. It's something I have lived across 3 different languages and 3 different continents. And that's something I put together much later, but it's really key to all the work that I do is, I was born in California, born into, I say I won the linguistic lottery. I was born into the English language, first of all, which by itself is the lottery.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was born into an accent that is recognized worldwide, respected, heard on YouTube videos and all the celebrities and newscasters and Hollywood movies. I sound like Hollywood and sun-kissed beaches. This is people hear me and that's the ideas they get. And that was very lucky. And I grew up thinking, I don't have an accent. Everyone else has an accent. I'm normal. And so that first period, the first up into my late teens, when I started traveling around the US and traveling abroad, I was the norm, and had all the privilege of that. Then I studied abroad in Austria. I worked in Switzerland. I have a bachelor's in German language. So I was operating in High German in areas that only spoke dialect. So they were angry. They would have to speak High German with me. Then they would make fun of the way I spoke. Then my pronunciation wasn't good enough or I used the wrong words. And I was treated like a 5-year-old in every interaction. Studying in the German language in Austria, having to give presentations in German, having to struggle through operating at an academic level in a foreign language. I don't think any of us can possibly comprehend how difficult that is for the great majority of the world studying in English. Yeah. And then I moved off to Denmark, married a Dane, speak Danish fluently, work and operate fully confident, or it looks like that from the outside looking in. People think I'm a fully confident, fluent Danish speaker, but I don't raise my hand as quickly to speak. And I'm very outspoken in English. I'm very confident. I can speak in front of thousands of people, no issue. In Danish, never in a million years. And how is that changing my impact? How does it change my voice? People stop meetings to talk about how charming my accent is. And it's like, I'm sorry, if I was speaking English right now, you would never stop a meeting to tell me I'm charming. Never. Like, where's the respect? And so what I would do is switch to English to get my power back. And it would be like, okay, you're going to sit here and make fun of me and treat me like a 5-year-old. Let's do this in English then. I know you speak English. Why don't we do it in English? And then I get my respect back. I get my power back. It's 100% power play. And this is what happens in every multinational company around the world, right? Yeah. And then one day I realized, whoa, wait a second. What about the people who can't do that? I'm pretty lucky and privileged that I can switch to English. Yeah. What about the people who speak Thai and Indonesian and Malaysian and Mandarin even? What do they do operating in an English-speaking world every day, not being respected, not having their full voices, not being able to express themselves authentically? So that was the second chapter. And then the third was moving to Singapore, where I'm currently based, and being put on the absolute pedestal of language. Because as a former British colony, they have always looked at British English as the standard, as the gold standard. And it is one of the 4 official languages in Singapore. And anyone who teaches English or teaches communication skills should embody these very high level forms of English. When I first came in 2006, someone asked how I could teach pronunciation because I was American. So British English was 100% gold standard, and that was the only thing they wanted. But now, over the past however many years, almost 20 years, there's been a massive shift toward American English. And so I was able to build a business here in Singapore much faster than any local Singaporean could have done, especially in the field of communications, because I'm white, I'm Western, and I speak American English. So really, really crazy kind of life experiences where I've been on every side of this equation, from extreme prestige to full-on discrimination about the way I speak and meetings being interrupted. And also from that monolingual perspective of, what do you mean I have an accent? Like, I'm normal. Yeah. And why should I change how I speak? Like, I'm the English speaker. So yeah. I've been on all sides and from these different perspectives. So that has created this deep sense of empathy for my clients. And I really think that's why they come to me, because they recognize that and feel it and know that I have experienced what they're experiencing. So you're absolutely right. Very inquisitive, to know that, yeah, it comes from a place of very deep empathy, because I felt it. I know it. Yeah, I live it.
Yeah. So fascinating. It's bringing back memories of when I lived in Tokyo and I had to learn survival Japanese. And then I ended up working in a British Telecom, Japan Telecom joint venture, where thankfully the language of business was English. And so I was very comfortable there. But that's when I realized, oh, I think if I try and speak in my survival Japanese at that point, I don't think I was perceived as being as intelligent or as knowledgeable. Is there research that talks about the impact on perception when you're not in as solid a command of language, that you're perceived to be less knowledgeable?
Yeah.
Today's episode of the Happy Space podcast is sponsored by ClareKumar.com. With sensitivity, curiosity, and courage, I serve 3 groups asking the tough questions that lead to meaningful answers. Number 1, I coach ambitious leaders to design for well-being and achieve next-level work-life integration. Number 2, I mic drop thought bombs. That's bombs as in BALMS. In keynotes and workshops, helping organizations achieve the business imperative that is inclusivity. And 3, I collaborate with brands concerned with respect for well-being on product design, marketing, and PR. If any of this piqued your interest, come find me at clarekumar.com. I'd love to speak with you. Designing inclusive performance together will lead to the richest results.
There's a lot of research on this, specifically towards accents. There are accent and attitude studies. So we have a lot on what our attitudes are towards certain accents. So and there's been great work in Canada that's been done on this, in the US, UK. I mean, accents and attitudes is a massive field. And what they're usually looking at is, how do you perceive this person? And they're normally looking at a scale ranging from friendliness to competence. And those are the two, the dichotomy there is you can be friendly, but you're not so competent, or you can be competent, but you're not seen as so friendly. So a study done. Yeah. But if you think about it, this happens a lot. Like from an American perspective, we have the Southern states English. And the Southerners are considered very hospitable, very friendly, very warm, everything, but a little dim. They aren't seen as competent. They aren't seen as smart. And whereas Northerners are very smart and on the ball and got everything together, but not incredibly friendly and warm. And children as young as 9 in the US were able to make that distinction. They were able to say, oh, this voice, they're very, very smart, but I don't think they're as friendly. And the Southern voice is very friendly, but not so smart.
Is that why y'all is becoming more popular as a term? It's like a warm address.
Yeah, but that's stemming from linguistic inclusion, or not even linguistic inclusion, but inclusive language. So that has started happening because saying you guys, which is pretty much common all over America, you guys is seen as leaving women out of the equation. Although for, as long as my life, we've always used it as non-gender, but of course it's gendered. You're saying guys. I mean, a guy is a guy. So it is gendered. So y'all is the one that is really gaining prominence now. And it's interesting because when I have calls with people in the US, they'll use it and I'll be like, you're not from the South. Why do you say that? Like, I get very confused because it doesn't fit my picture. Right.
Yes.
But it's one of the alternatives we have to you guys, and we don't have a lot of alternatives. So things like folks and y'all, and those are really hard for me because I grew up having this culture where speaking like a Southerner is not as smart. So if I start using y'all and folks, I'm almost putting myself in that category. So accent bias, I can study it. I can know everything about it. I can be the biggest advocate in the world. I still have it. We all have it. But the point is, we need to be aware of it and where it's showing up. You need to know that, oh, wow, I do actually have a bias against those Southern. I love hearing them. I think they're awesome. They sound fantastic and so friendly and warm and nice. But yeah, I do have that cultural impression that they're not as bright because I'm not willing to talk like them because I think that that is sounding less bright. So you have to really be aware of that. You really have to be aware. And, you know, the same thing, what I was going to say about the Canadian study, right? So off the back of the study of 9-year-olds in the South in America, the Canadians set out to prove that Canadian children were not as biased as American children because they've grown up in a more multilingual, multicultural society. So these researchers in Toronto set up a study to have these 5-year-old children listen to, they would show them, they would say, these are all teachers, and listen to these different teachers. And some were speaking English with the same standard English that the children spoke. Some had a French accent. And then there were also like Dutch and Australian or something else mixed in there. The 5-year-old children already could identify that not only did they like the English speaker more than the others, they went a step further to say this teacher would be the best teacher. They were not just, they didn't just sound the best, they would be the best teacher. So sorry, Canadians, the kids are not less biased, even though they're growing up in a very multilingual, multicultural, because the argument was, well, you know, the Americans are kind of, you know, but the Canadians are so, you know, Toronto's one of the most multilingual, multicultural cities in the world, yet it's still there. It's baked in. So you can't escape it. You can't escape it. Okay. Isn't it fascinating? So, I get so jazzed up about it because
it's so interesting. It's taking me back to when I used to read Harry Potter to my kids before bed. And for my brain to stay awake at that time where you're starting to recline and you just want to doze off and just give into sleep, I embodied all of the characters and gave them all the accents. And my kids would be so mad at me. They're like, no, mom, just mom's voice. We just, no, don't do all of these. They didn't like it. So I don't know what that says. Probably
That's funny. I'm surprised because you would think the kids would find that so entertaining, right? I mean, it's it develops the character because if you look at things like Disney films, I mean, animated films, these are probably the best example of how we teach this in culture. If you look at a Disney film like The Lion King, and we have the star of the show with the hero American voice. And then we have his brother who speaks with a British accent.
That puzzled me.
Unless
he was away at boarding school for some reason.
I know. I have no idea. How did that happen?
No.
And these 2 lions are in Africa. Like, why? Why? No, nobody has any kind of like African English accents. And there is no African English, of course, because there are many, many, many varieties of how English is spoken in Africa, depending on the hundreds of thousands of languages that are the native languages there. But then we have, again, it playing out the hero American voice and then the villain British voice. And they're chosen because in animated film, to build the characters, you have to play into those stereotypes. And by playing into the stereotype, it enforces the characterization of that character. And I'm thinking of Cars. Cars is another example, thinking of that Southern accent. There's a pickup truck with a really heavy Southern drawl in Cars. And he's the most lovable, sweetest, kindest, most hospitable character. Yeah, you can do it. You're so good. And yet, but he's as dumb as can be in that show. You know, he's like never catching on, never following along. He's just, you know, the dumb character. And so you see how from a very, very young age, we're already taught this. So it's no wonder a 5-year-old, a 9-year-old, of course they can pick it out. Of course they have attitudes.
I'm thinking of you know, Homer Simpson, The Simpsons, right? And Apu, I think it was in that character, right? And how you're racially profiling the character and building an expectation Right. But I mean, it's funny. So my heritage is Indian and English. So my dad, I didn't understand he had an accent until I heard him on the radio saying population. I'm like, what?
Mhm.
Who said what? And then my mom speaks like the queen. So I've always had these
Oh,
different
wow.
accents around,
Interesting.
lived in Japan.
Uh-huh.
And my son, he's got an amazing ear. So
Nice.
I'm sort of getting into this a bit sideways. First, I wanted to make a comment about mimicry and
Mhm.
ear and the ability to hear sound differently to
Mhm.
produce accents.
Mhm.
Um, I look at that as potential. My hypothesis is, and you can shatter my hypothesis if I'm wrong. I was thinking this is an asset if you wanted to build a relationship and build rapport with someone and also not be considered other.
Mhm.
So when I worked at Nortel back in the day and we had offices where I was in Toronto, Brampton, and our Taipei. And at the end of a phone call, I would say, bye, y'all, back to the person. It was involuntary. I was talking to them on phone by the end of the call. Bye, y'all. I'm like, bye,
Yeah.
y'all. It was not, it
Yeah.
was
Not intentional.
control. Yeah. And I'm like, oh, what have I done?
Mm.
Can you talk a little bit about our human nature to mimic,
Mm.
and whether it's a strength, whether it's total liability? I kind of wonder if it is, or where are we
This
with
is,
that?
yeah, from a linguistic perspective, it's a huge, huge question. And there are a few different things overlapping. So I'm wondering the best way to answer this. But
Mm,
to take it from a real basic level, there's communication accommodation theory, which talks about how very, very naturally and in the most minuscule ways, we will change the way we communicate to match the person we're communicating with.
yeah.
If we want to create collaboration, if we want to create cooperation, we will
Mhm.
very, very naturally
Yeah.
make very minor shifts to match and meet that person. And they'll be doing the same towards us, assuming we're on the same page and we're trying.
Mhm.
And I think as our world becomes more global and we have a lot more contact with people very different from ourselves, we're seeing this happen more and more, that it's not just about some little minor shift like articulating ing more clearly. I
Mm.
mean, we do little things like that. We come into the room, we recognize the formality of that room, we recognize the way people are speaking, and we understand immediately. Here, I'm going to use a more formal register. I'm going to not say gonna and those I'll say going to, and I'm going to articulate more because this is a formal setting and we understand that context and that
Yeah.
domain, and we use the register that's appropriate. But we do this very, very naturally.
Mhm.
Where we're running into some problems now is as cultures are colliding more and more, and these accents are colliding, the problem is that accents aren't equal
Mm.
and languages aren't equal. So I've been struggling with this a lot. And also when it comes to humor, comedians will do a lot with accents, and we think it's hilarious because it resonates and it's so true, right? It fits all the stereotypes we have. It's just so perfect.
Well, Russell Peters was a fabulous example of that.
Just so
Russell, right?
amazing,
Yeah.
just amazing, right? And I mean, I've never been able to do that, and I'm so jealous because I wish I could imitate accents. But at the same time, I even here living in Singapore,
Mm.
where they speak the Singapore variety of English and also a more colloquial Singlish.
Mm.
I feel very uncomfortable mimicking that or using it because I'm an English speaker, and being an English speaker, that puts me at a different hierarchy, a different level of the hierarchy. So for me, imitating them, I feel like it's mockery.
Mm.
Now, often they don't feel it that way. They'll be like, "Oh, you speak Singlish," and they'll think it's really kind of funny. But for me, I feel like it's mockery. And I'll see, the big American speakers get off the plane and come in to do a conference and add law at the end of every sentence, acting like, oh, we're similar. Like, look at me meeting you. And I find it ridiculous. Like you know nothing about this culture. Adding law at the end, it's like going to Canada and me just saying a at the end of
Hey.
every single sentence.
Yeah.
It's obnoxious.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so but what I'm trying to sort of point to here is this hierarchy.
Yeah.
If someone who is Singaporean accommodates to me and speaks more American, I don't even recognize it or realize that they're doing it. It just seems normal because I'm higher on the hierarchy. But if I suddenly walk in and start throwing out Singapore English, I feel like it could be seen as mocking because that language is not at the same level of the hierarchy, if that makes sense. Now, this is just through
Hierarchy
my
depends on context too,
very
right?
much context.
Right?
If it's a
Right?
dinner party, it's very different than in the boardroom. I
Well,
mean,
and where you are
yeah.
in the world, right? That the hierarchy of English in an English domain is
Mhm.
right up there. But
Yeah.
my hierarchy, English in Japan was very useless at times. So it was
Totally
no value
different.
to it at all. So
Totally different.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But
And
I
then the
wanted,
other thing that's interesting from your perspective and your son's, growing up from birth, you had access to multiple sound systems.
mm-hmm.
Now, there is a very incorrect assumption that children can't learn multiple languages at once. They
Mm-hmm.
can't, it's too much. Their brains can't take it all in. They shouldn't, you should focus on one language at a time, or make sure that there's no code switching happening. Don't let them switch in and out of languages. This is complete nonsense
Mm-hmm.
from a linguistic perspective. Children can learn all different kinds of languages. Someone just this morning, I woke up, I had a message from someone, a meme saying, Princess Charlotte can already speak 2 languages at 2 years old. And someone had made a comment, yeah, that's kind of normal for every immigrant population, but I guess it's different when you're poor, like what, why is it that we have such weird assumptions about how language works? But what's really cool is that you grew up, you were hearing this British variety of English, this Indian variety of English. You were learning totally different sound systems. Were you also learning Indian languages at the same time?
No, I mean I can say stop feeding me in Hindi and Mera Naam Shanta hai, which is my name. It's interesting. When I'm in India, I go by my middle name because I
Interesting.
know it's more easily understood. Shanta.
Yeah.
It's an Indian
Yeah.
name, so I'm like
And it's
Shanta Kumar,
common.
right? So I make
Yeah.
it part of it, and we'll get to this. Is how do we make it easier when we want to communicate well with people? Are there things that we can do that are bridges? So when I was in Japan, watashi no namae wa Kureya Kumaru desu. My name is Claire Kumar. Kureya Kumaru is how I would say it to a Japanese person. So they would go, I know your name, right?
Mhm.
Rather than having them really struggle with Claire Kumar,
Mhm.
right? They don't have the L
Yeah.
sound, right?
Yeah. L and
So
R are the same. Yeah. It's a different.
yeah. So I didn't speak Indian languages, but we were also in Canada, and my mom used to mock how we spoke here because she's like, "Why do you say water? It's water."
Yeah.
And I'm like, "Well, you brought us here, so it's your
Yeah.
problem. You're gonna have to deal with it."
It's really hard because it's really hard because I've been very careful about that. I can say raising my kids in Singapore because they went into Singapore daycare, local daycare, where they spoke straight Singapore English with all Chinese. They were learning Mandarin, they had English, and then the common language they all spoke was Singapore English. And of course, same thing that happened to you. You want to belong with your friends. You don't want to sound like your mom. You want to sound like your friends
Yeah.
because your mom's not cool.
Yeah.
You need to sound like your friends.
I know that
And
now.
so,
Yeah.
yeah. And it's so funny because one day my daughter came home, and she got all the Scandinavian genes from my husband, the Dane, and bright blonde curls, blue eyes, and walks in and says, Ayo, mommy, I forgot my water bottle. And I was like, and I just stood there shocked because I thought, what just came out of my 3-year-old's mouth? Like, I just didn't even know she could talk like that.
Yeah.
And it just didn't match, right? Like, we talk a lot about ethnicity and language, and when your face doesn't match the sounds coming out of your mouth, how discrimination happens there. So I was doing that to my daughter, but I just stood there speechless. And she goes, oh, sorry, mommy, sorry. I forgot my water bottle at school. And I'm like, no, I understood you. I just was taken aback.
Yes.
But I was always really, really careful not to make judgmental statements like,
Yeah.
that's wrong. Don't talk like that. Why are you talking like that? We don't say
Yeah.
it like that.
Yeah.
I'm not being completely honest. That has come out of my mouth before. Like, hey, why are you, especially if they bring up British pronunciations, I'm like, why do you say it like that? We say water.
But
I
it's
try
so
not to.
funny, right? So if somebody says schedule, I bristle because I grew up with schedule.
Mhm.
Why do we have that reaction? Because it's almost like that's a hyper point of repulsion to a sound.
Yeah.
Why do we have that? Why
And
do I
these are
care
the
so much?
biases. It's
Why do
yeah,
I
why do
care?
we care so much? It's just what we have been taught is right versus wrong. And we just fixate on that. This is right, this is wrong. Our English teachers taught us this is right, this is wrong. And to
Yes,
be the good student, to get the A,
yes,
to be accepted in the society, to be seen
yes,
as the good student or the good worker or the good
yeah,
CEO, whatever it
yeah,
might be, you have to do everything the right way, the acceptable, educated, high status,
yeah.
all of these good things that we emulate, you need to do it the right way. So when someone walks in and does it the other way, it's like, ah,
That's why
who
we're
taught
grammar
you that?
police too. We're spelling
Yep.
police, we're grammar police, we're
Mhm.
all of it. We're like,
Mhm.
don't do that. And it's,
Yeah.
as I notice the immigration population growing here,
Mhm.
I'm thinking there has to be an increased acceptance, tolerance, forgiveness. I'm being asked to overlook in my building. Somebody spent mindful with two L's on the end. I'm like, ooh, that's not how we do that. And I have not crossed off the other L with my pen. I have not. I've just left it there because this is my learning and growing is where I noticed my teachers, my kids' teachers in high school were less caring about spelling. So I don't know anybody spelling who is hot damn good right now because
Mhm.
we've kind of let it go. And we're
Mhm.
taking the vowels out of words anyway. And we're just
Mhm.
like, you can read it anyway, right? So it feels like we're in this real crux of change. But
Mhm.
I want to share there's a memory I have of a kid of going to the Toronto Science Center. And they had an exhibit about bias that was so effective. It stayed with me since I was just a kid. They had this exhibit where they had people and you could press a button and hear them, but they were all different voices.
Uh-huh.
So it was the Haitian with a high English accent. It
Oh, how
was an
nice.
Indian speaking French. It was like, you're just like,
Wow.
oh, and you just press the button again and again and again because you're like, oh, can't compute. It's not what I've been,
Yeah. It's
not
like
what I've been
total
fed.
dissonance. Yeah.
Yes.
That issue, when the face doesn't match the sounds, we get really confused.
Yeah.
It's like, wait, I've been taught that this is the way the world works, and you're completely breaking down my whole world view
Yes.
by sounding different than you look. It doesn't make sense. And we completely it's just total cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, so
And
it's
that happens.
occupying our brain. Our brain is actually hijacked by this thing, foreign, foreign, foreign. So that's where the resistance is coming from. So what should we tell ourselves when we notice this?
It's about slowing down the judgment, right? Because it's going to happen. It's going to happen no matter what. And I mean, I would love to say, oh, we can get rid of bias. And like, that's not possible. It's not
Well,
going to happen.
bias is a tool to keep us safe.
It is. It is.
Ultimately,
And so
yeah.
we're always going to have that. And it stems from that idea of, oh, you're different than me. You're scary.
You might be
Whereas
dangerous.
now, yeah. And now we're in a world where being different isn't scary anymore. We're
Yeah.
all different. And how do we bridge? And so it's about slowing down that negative reaction or recognizing it and being like, okay, that's normal, but we're
Yeah.
not going to listen to that. Like,
Yeah.
let's put that on pause. We're going to put it in a bubble, blow it away, and refocus here to listen and respect to this person. So knowing, whatever the bias might be, I mean, I'm sure that you've probably experienced it, your father or through stories have seen that bias against Indian English. I mean, there's a very strong bias globally against Indian English.
Mhm.
And and I think a lot of it stems from the call center industry, especially from an American perspective, where people are already screaming at their computers and then they have to call someone for IT help and then have communication difficulties because they've never had contact with that style of speech. And so
Hey,
they
yeah.
get
I have to
more
bring
upset.
up, yeah, I have to bring up a show we had in Canada a little while ago called Little Mosque on the Prairie. And
Oh,
it was, well, Canadians can do
little
this because
mosque.
we're like, of course you would have somebody that's immigrated there and we have a little mosque on the prairie. But I used to joke that that was actually call center understanding training in disguise planted into the Canadians. This is a decade ago, I think. And
Yeah,
we had a lot of customer service overseas and you
yeah.
were just like, oh my gosh, I don't understand. I have a pretty good ear for it and still sometimes
Yeah.
I'm like, no. I had a gentleman call me from India. He's got a startup. And he didn't put his camera on in our meet and greet. And I said, you need to put your camera on. You need to
Mm.
invite the understanding through lips as well as the sound, because
It
my
helps
ear's
a lot.
pretty good, but buddy, this is going to be very difficult for anybody else. And he's being very quickly, and oh my God, I need everything, right? It's not it's so what do you do to help someone understand? Cameras on, as much information as possible.
Yeah, yeah.
This bridging.
Cameras on, good audio equipment. I mean, just the distraction. The reason we have a lot of even more trouble with call centers is all the background noise. The connection is never good.
Yeah.
There's tons of background noise.
I
You're
hang
hearing
up.
other people's conversations.
Yeah,
You cannot focus to
that's
even
right.
understand.
That's
And
right.
so we really need to be better about creating quiet environments, making sure we have good audio equipment. Just especially once the pandemic hit, this was a massive problem
Yeah.
because people who you could normally understand, suddenly you couldn't understand them anymore. It wasn't so much the understanding, it was we had all these weird connection issues and
And we had
pauses
masks. I had
and
Zoom calls with
masks
people
on.
with masks on. I'm like,
Oh man. Yeah, I would love to do a study with doctors because I thought there must be something we can learn from doctors who are in
dentists,
masks in an
even dentists.
operating room,
Yeah.
giving life and death calls and decisions and asking for
Mm,
tools. And how are they communicating
mm,
behind masks all the time? And they're
mhm,
doing life and death stuff. And
mhm.
here we just had to grocery shop with a mask on and we're having trouble. Like,
Well,
what's
but
going
we also had
on?
a plastic window between us, and you couldn't
Yes,
actually
things
hear
like that to
anyway. So,
hear.
oh, it was so
So
bad.
much of that was really, really difficult. So sometimes it's as simple as having the right tech, creating the right environments.
Mhm.
But more than that, when it comes to tuning our ears to accents, it's around language contact. So if we go back to, when we're babies and born, and that's why I was saying, you had all these different inputs,
Mhm.
whereas a monolingual, like me, when I was growing up, I only heard English and I only heard it from in the dialect
Yeah.
that my parents spoke. And then I went to school and they all spoke the same way as my parents, and my whole community spoke that way, my city, my everything. And so at a very, very young age, we're talking within the first 1 year already, we've already identified what is my language, what sounds are a part of my language, what sounds are excess that I don't need to pay attention to. And
Mhm.
we've already sorted it. And we know the patterning of the language. We hear already the tonality of the language in the womb. We already know what is our language. So when we don't grow up with all this input, and one of the reasons we don't is this inaccurate assumption that we cannot handle, our brains can't handle these multiple languages. They absolutely can.
Mhm.
And so we end up growing up with just this one variety. We don't have the input of all these other sounds. And
Yeah.
therefore, we lose the ability to produce those sounds because we never needed them.
Right. And
So
it's
we,
the whole tongue, mouth shape,
all of it,
right?
the articulation, which is why I would guess you are so good at imitating accents, picking them up, because you heard all those different sounds. You played with them in your mouth. You were able to pull them up when you needed and wanted them because you found them interesting and they were still in your vicinity. You were
Yeah.
hearing them. And that's one reason I think that they would have done that study in Canada with these little 5-year-olds saying, yeah, but you guys have grown up with all these sounds, like you know them. Why would you be biased? The bias
Mhm.
is still there, even with the ability to produce a number of sounds that maybe a typical monolingual English speaker couldn't produce.
Mhm.
But the bias is still going to be imprinted because as you're learning all these different sounds and varieties, you're also learning when they're appropriate to use and when they are not, what they mean, what it means for you to use, what you can get when you use those sounds, what the reward is for using those sounds, or the punishment for using those sounds. You're taught that at the same time at that very, very young age.
Yeah.
And so the bias is already baked in. But this is also why I think my children are also incredibly good with accents and sounds because they've grown up hearing a multitude, Danish, English, Mandarin, and now in school, all through school in an international school, their friends speak all different languages. They speak bits and pieces of a million languages, and
Yeah.
then they can imitate each other and they play with that. So it's very, very fascinating.
Yeah, this is so interesting. I've got to just share that my son has a very good ear. I think musicality and ability to hear sounds does that have there's innate ability
Yeah,
there
I
too?
think that there is. I mean, we don't have enough research. I'm not aware of the specific
Yeah,
research on it, but we do have innate abilities to hear those sounds. I mean, my daughter's also incredibly musical, which I
yeah,
don't tend to be. So it could be the musicality piece that
yeah.
also helps
I think
in
so.
hearing them.
share why, because my son's father, third
Mhm.
generation Japanese,
Mhm.
heard his mother speak Japanese to his grandmother, like heard it, no accent. We lived in Tokyo for 3 years. I would be the speaker because I would say, futari was two people for dinner, two people. Futatsu is two things. He would go into the restaurant and say futatsu, and they would not know what he meant. And he looks 100% Japanese. So you can imagine the dissonance for
Yeah.
the people. And then I would speak, and they would be like,
What is going
what is
on?
going on here? But my son has this ear too. I think he's got a good ear. And so he had an Indian accent uh, biology or science teacher in grade 7. He came home doing a better Indian accent than me. And he'd be pretend to answer the phone. This is your IT department. And I'm like, Benjamin, you can't do that. You are going
Yeah.
to get your head kicked Indian. You are you are going to
Indeed.
get you can't do this because he looks half
Yeah.
Japanese, part Caucasian, part Indian,
Wow.
right? So
Wow.
he does not look
Yeah.
Indian. I'm like, you're gonna be in trouble, boy. Like,
Yeah, because it's okay if it's okay to make fun of yourself, right? An Indian to make fun of Indian English, that's okay. It's not so okay for someone who's passing white to make fun. And
I
that's sort
pass
of this
Italian.
hierarchy.
I
Yeah,
pass
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Italian, so people are like,
Right?
well, "Are you sure you can do that?" I'm like, "Buddy,
Yeah.
yes, I can."
Yeah.
But then I would
Yeah.
do. I remember having a TA in biochemistry of Chinese descent,
Uh-huh.
Lisa Feng, and my
Uh-huh.
friend Julie was Korean descent, and I would impersonate Richard to Julie all the time. Like I would. It
Yeah.
was just a thing to do that was terribly entertaining, but
Mhm.
maybe terribly awful also.
Yeah, yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, looking back and like thinking
Richard,
about it,
Richard,
you know.
I love
Yeah.
you, Judy. I used to say, I
Yeah.
love you, Judy.
Yeah, yeah. And it's
Well,
just so easy, especially if you have a talent for it, you know, and people do find it really, really funny. But that's why I've been really split on, where does humor come into this? Humor and
yeah,
accents, and when is it appropriate? When is it inappropriate? Is it
yeah,
ever appropriate? You know,
yeah,
it reminds me of, decades and decades ago when blackface in American
yeah.
culture, there was a lot done to impersonate and make a parody of African Americans.
Mhm.
And that was funny at
Yeah.
that time. We would
Well, Justin
never
Trudeau has
dream.
a whole scandal about
Right?
actually, yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
So I
yeah.
wonder the things that we find very funny and acceptable now with
Mhm.
language and accent, because we aren't quite there in this journey, will we eventually look back and say, I can't believe people said that. I can't believe people ever did that. Because
Curious.
I think we're at the very start line of this discussion around language and accent. And for years and years, women have been told to act more like men, and Black women have been told to do their hair differently, to be more professional. And these
Yeah.
are all things that we've come to realize that's not cool. Yet we can still sit here and say, but you need to speak a certain way. Like, this is still acceptable to say. Like, your language and your accent and your communication skills are not good enough. They are not normal enough.
Yeah.
And that I wonder if we're just at the start of that shift now.
At the same time, we have a sense of, yes, broadening our respect for more and understanding what that means. Yeah, it's a really interesting time. And I don't want to end this conversation at all, but I want to end with one question, which is for people that are here and they're come to Canada. We had 1 million people come on a third country of 39 million. We had 1 million come last year. And I think the government has now started to try and slow down immigration a little bit because I say we're having our own fire fest, which means the government hasn't made sure we have accommodation or healthcare or so on for all these people. So we need to be careful we can support what's happening. But oh God, what was my question? Oh yeah, so for people that are coming, because we have so many more people coming and they want to be successful here. I remember in your TED Talk, you talked about there are specific sounds that are important to be matching phonetically and pronunciation, and other sounds don't matter so much. So what would you say to the people who are coming to Canada and maybe to the US or another English speaking country? What sounds
Mhm.
actually matter if you want to be really effective, but still hold on to who you are?
Mhm. Well, this goes back to research that's called the lingua franca core. And this research isn't perfect. We need a lot more research on it. And it's primarily used to discuss when non-native speakers speak with other non-native speakers. But it's all we've got. So I expand it and say, try it with the native speakers as well. Because I think it makes a lot of sense. And one of the main things is the consonant sounds all need to be unique. So your T and D, which in the Indian English accent, the T's and D's are very, very different and they overlap quite a bit. And to a Canadian or American ear, we don't hear those differences. So those need to be separated and be very clearly a D and a T. And a lot of this has to do with voice and unvoiced sounds. So a D and T are a perfect example. T is T, D is D. Hooked on Phonics made me crazy because, my kids would come home saying P says pa. And I'd say, no, it doesn't. P says p, B says b. Because if you learn to add voice onto your P, then you say things like paper instead of paper. And so very, very teeny tiny slight distinctions, but that actually makes the biggest difference for my clients when they start to separate the voiced and unvoiced sounds and get the consonant sounds correct. So that's one really big first one. I love your cat. That cat, I just want to, I want to pet it.
He's
So
more creative in the way he tries to interrupt me. For anybody who's not
yeah.
watching YouTube right now, it was like a
have
two-paw, almost want to take down, hug you, pull you into my snack world now. Theo,
so
this
cute.
makes me, oh my gosh, that was funny.
Yeah. So the
Yeah,
consonant sounds are big.
yeah.
That's a big one.
So paying attention to
Vowels are not
consonants.
as important as long as you are consistent. So if you use British vowels, you use American vowels, just try not to mix them up. If you say path, then you should also say bath. So don't say, I need to take a bath after I walk down the path. Then I'm going to be like, wait, hold on. I just taught my brain that you say bath and
Yes.
path. And now you're switching it. Like, now I'm confused. So being
Well,
consistent,
this is why actors who don't do accents well in movies,
they slip. They're
oh,
slipping. They're
it's
slipping.
yes, it's cringy.
Yeah.
Cringy,
Yeah.
right? You're like,
And the
oh.
vowels are what hold our accents. That's the signal to us that, oh, this is a different English. The vowels change. Our consonants don't change very much. It's the
That's why
vowels.
music, when you're singing, hearing a singer, you don't hear accent,
Yeah, you don't hear it,
right? I'm
right?
like, where did it go? But
So
unless it's kind of
interesting.
part spoken, you don't hear
Yeah.
it,
Yeah.
right?
So interesting. So
Oh my God.
the vowels don't need so much focus. It's the consonant sounds we need to get really specific, and then it's about adding what, from a linguistic perspective, nuclear stress, which is the main stress within a block of language. So where are you stressing the word? Where's the most important word? This is another good example with an Indian English example, because Indian English, the tones go up and down a lot more often. So when you go up, I hear it and it's a signal to me that that word is stressed. It's important, because what do we do when we stress in an American, more North American varieties of English? We make it louder, longer, higher pitch in order to emphasize something. So if I want to make something really important, I go up with my voice. That's how I signal
Right.
that emphasis. And so knowing how to use the voice effectively to emphasize and stress the word that is most important and not stress connecting words and little function words, which in many other varieties of English is very common, Singapore English as well. They'll stress little function words. And it's like, but that's not important. Why are you making that word important with your voice through our filter? Okay. If we're talking about a global international context, then I'm like, go for it. There's no reason not to. It's not going to impede understanding.
Right.
But in a native speaking environment in North America, then we want to try to have those emphasized
Modulation.
words in our sentences. That's going to make a big difference. And the last piece I would say is the consonant clusters, like an STR, string. We can't be dropping any of those sounds. It's very common to hear something like shring. We need all three of those sounds in there,
Right.
or else we get confused. So those groups of sounds, and those can be really, really difficult for people who aren't born into English. So that's another one that's quite important. But sounds that have been drilled by English teachers, like the TH, doesn't really matter. It could
Yes.
be a T, a D, a S, a Z, a F, V. Even in native varieties of English, they're spoken that way. If you go all over the UK, people use F and V normally. But then a foreigner immigrates and we say, no, you can't say it like that. Well, the Irish do. Like, why not? Like, or whatever. It's very funny how there's multiple layers of discrimination built in. And when we start overlapping them, we can see those. So from that perspective of perhaps being a foreign language speaker coming into North America, trying to fit in and belong, it's that element of belonging that makes you want to sound more like the people around you. So you're going to be accommodating more. You're going to be trying to impersonate, emulate the speakers around you. But the way to get there a little faster is first with those consonant sound, really focus on consonants, and then trying to mimic the of the way that we're speaking in North America, which is quite different from a great majority of international varieties of English from Africa, India, Asia, East Asia. Very different patterning.
Well, different languages have different paces.
Yeah.
Right? Southern India, in Kerala, oh my, it just happened. And do you find that people from different cultures come to English and they bring their pacing with it?
Oh, yeah.
Right. So one of the things I just gave a course, a class a couple of weeks ago to people considering coming to Canada to further their careers. And one of my recommendations was to slow down their speaking to make sure the other person was landing. So to look for that comprehension. Do you think that's something to consider here as well?
Yeah. I think it's good for really any situation anywhere if we slow down our speech. Oh, there's another cat.
I only have two.
It must be dinner time.
Theo and Ellie, it's trick time. They have to earn their snacks now, and they're like, "Mom,
they're putting on a show.
Snack time," but they're both here. Yeah. So for you people,
look how good I am.
You're missing the duo.
Oh, it's so funny. Yeah. So, okay, what was the question?
We're talking about pacing. We were talking about
the pacing. Yes.
Interrupted by cats. Yeah.
Yeah. So the pacing, that bring the pace and the intonation, and that's really that's the big part, right? It's that totally different intonation and pacing. Yeah. But slowing down is a great tip no matter what. Now, where this might backfire, and this is what gets tricky. For example, I have a good friend in the US of Eastern European descent, has what I would consider a very light accent. I'm not even sure I would normally notice it, but within the American context, it's always noticed. And so when people hear her accent, they start slowing down. They assume they assume that the accent means her English, whereas she's like, working in a university educated, very highly intelligent, and speaks very fluent English. And she gets offended a bit when people obviously are slowing down their speech for her. And I think too, it's about maintaining the tone, because when we slow down, we can sound very patronizing. When I slow down and talk to you like this, like maybe you're a 5-year-old, that's very different from simply slowing the pace down and articulating my word endings so that it is clear, and keeping my normal tonality. And that's the shift we have to be really, really careful of. Are you just slowing down your pace, or are you also changing your tone and acting like there's something wrong with the other person? And we do that without recognizing we're doing it, without realizing it. A lot like how Americans are known for slowing down and talking a lot louder to a foreigner, because they assume like somehow if you're louder, they're going to, I don't know, understand it better. So we have to be a little bit careful about how we apply it, as with everything, it's context, but and really getting to understand and know the person's language level and all of that. But that takes contact. And this is where we go wrong, because the minute we hear someone different, it's like, oh, we get this shock of anxiety of, oh, I don't know if I can understand them. And that person saying, oh, I don't know if they can understand me. And then what do? We press mute and we go opposite directions. And what we really need is more contact, more interaction, more understanding, because then we learn where we are linguistically. We learn what we need to do to accommodate. We know, and we can't do that if we don't talk.
And
So
if you extend your speak up point from your unmuted book, How to Speak Up, can you not ask for what you need? I've asked people to slow down. I've asked English speakers
yes,
to slow down
yes,
because I
yes,
can't keep up sometimes,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Can we
yeah.
not ask for what we need? I'm having trouble understanding. Can you please?
Yeah, having that confidence to do that. The problem is in a business environment, that could be seen, and from a cross-cultural perspective, it could be seen as losing face. It could be seen as not knowing your stuff. Like, I should have English that's good enough. I told them in my interview I spoke fluent English, and now I'm having difficulty understanding. So
Yes.
I can't tell them that I didn't understand. For us who are native speakers, it's easier for us to speak up and say, "Sorry, can you slow? Whoa, I'm like repeat that. I lost it." But for someone who doesn't have English as their first language, to speak up and say that is almost like a deficiency. Like, oh yeah, see, oh yeah, I forgot that you don't speak English like I do, and let me simplify it for you, right? There's a whole different dimension there that makes it much harder to speak up and ask for what you need because of this negative perception on the other side. And that can affect your career. It can affect your promotion. It's like, well, you haven't been following along in the meetings as well as we'd like you to. Like, maybe your communication skills, maybe you need an English trainer, maybe, and it's not the case, right?
But it's interesting because my love flies a helicopter, and there are people all over the world who fly with him, and he will bring me home stories of people whose English is like not clear enough to be understood. But and thank God there's two pilots sometimes.
Yeah,
Because-
and that's a bit scary. There's a whole world of aviation English
Yeah,
that is spoken, between air traffic control and pilots.
yeah.
And interestingly, my very first job when I moved to Singapore was teaching 1,800 pilots how to improve their public announcements for a certain Singapore airline.
Yeah.
And so it was this is the craziness of it. One day class, they send in 20 pilots, captains, first officers, for one day to learn how to speak clearly and show more empathy in emergency situations and connect with passengers over an announcement system.
Right.
Nothing in the world is going to happen in one day, I can tell you that. And yet we ran this course for a year and a half. 1,800 pilots came through the door. They were all required to take it. But the pilots know and understand the differences. Like, they knew that if a Japanese pilot was on the radio, they would say Jilo, and they knew that that meant zero because the Z and the J switches, the L and the R switch. And so they just knew, and they were aware enough, had enough command of the different accents, and knew the languages well enough and what was coming into them.
They got there. Day one, they didn't, but they got there.
They learn it very quickly. But there is an aviation English that all pilots have to pass, a standard testing that they must pass in order to be flying internationally. You might not believe that when you hear these announcements, because depending on where you are in the world, it's very difficult to understand. And I mean, I've lived out here how many years? 14, 15 years. And traveling around Asia, it's very rare that I can understand pilots over the PA systems. Again, the tech, the loudness of the plane, the static in the thing. Sometimes it comes on, it's super loud. Sometimes you can't hear anything they're saying, and there's a screaming baby. And I mean, in an emergency, I don't know how I would survive because I can't even hear what's going on. But that's a very, very special context. And another situation where it is a life and death sort of situation that traffic control must understand the pilots and vice versa. And the pilots need to understand each other. And they have a lot of kind of, like you say, two pilots, they have a lot of ways to mitigate the situation to make sure if there was a misunderstanding, there's a backup, checklists, two pilots, checklist, balances, controls on every single step, so that if someone doesn't understand Jilo, somebody else does, or something else happens, and there's a very specific course of action. Maybe we could learn from that by putting those sorts of checklists and controls into our workplace communication.
I'm thinking there's something to that to take away from this conversation, to say, what do I want to do to be a more inclusive communicator? Looking around at who do you come across in your day, and what might you do to make them feel like they belong, and to be understood better yourself. So much
Yeah.
gold in this conversation, Heather. Thank you.
And we could talk all day long.
Clearly.
We could talk all day long about
Clearly, this was so rich, though, and listeners, listen. Find Heather Hansen. Well, all the links will be in the show notes, and to her TED Talk, to her book. There's you're working on your PhD now as well, which is very
Yeah.
exciting. So definitely follow Heather. And in the social media, she's Heather Hansen. There is another Heather Hansen, so be sure you have
Yes.
this Heather Hansen.
There's
We
a
haven't talked
handful
about
of
that
us.
beforehand. Yep, there's a couple Heather Hansens out there. But this is Heather Hansen, who's all just so knowledgeable around accent and bias and communication around the world. And it's been really a thrill and a treat to spend so much time with you and learn from you today. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Claire. Thanks for giving me the opportunity. It's been just such a nice, natural conversation with you. So we'll catch up even more and continue the conversation.
I love it. Thanks so much. Thanks so much for spending time here. Check out happyspacepod.com for links to all the episodes, including on YouTube, our online community, and helpful tools for work that fits. I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment on social media, or even better, drop a review. And please share with someone else who you know also deserves a happy space.